This conference will now be recorded.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad you can join us here for our third session of KnowledgeSync training. It's David Austin here. I am the product manager for KnowledgeSync, and I am the lucky person to present to you about REST APIs. So with that, let's take a look here at some of the information. Well, what we'll look at today is the basics. There's such a vast array of things you can learn about REST APIs, but certainly we're only going to cover what we can do within the confines of this meeting time. I'll say I will assume some level of knowledge for things around the internet or web browsers or servers and that sort of thing, and that you do have some exposure to KnowledgeSync in the past. And so I won't be starting at the very bottom of all this, and then certainly I won't be getting into excruciating detail either on the other end. And then certainly I want to discuss REST APIs in the context of KnowledgeSync. I also want us to get a bit of excitement about the REST APIs and what they'll mean for KnowledgeSync and for our customers. And then also some of what, or a lot of what I'll discuss today is in the KnowledgeSync version 10 manual. And so I didn't copy paste exactly, but it is in a lot of cases verbatim for what's in the manual, but I've abbreviated it here and will rely more on explaining and showing than just a description in text. And what we'll look at that is in the manual is what is a REST API at a high level, as well as what is JSON and JSON path. And then we'll go into an example within KnowledgeSync where we'll connect to our own Lasso CRM. Lasso is one of our ECI products, and we'll talk to the REST API that is part of that product. We'll look at what we need to do before we start calling APIs, some of the preparation that we need to do. As mentioned, we'll do that example. And then I'll take you through a quick showing of an application called Postman, which is very common and perhaps the most popular application for testing or troubleshooting REST APIs. So what is a REST API? Well, it's a web service that provides interoperability between computer systems on the internet. So that's a very high level, maybe less than useful description. So we'll need to show what it is, but at least that's the high level definition. The REST APIs communicate with the client using the same protocols used to access a web page. And so when you look at a web page with a web browser sends a GET command to an HTTP website address and receives an HTML response. And that's what you do when every day you visit a web page. And just the same way, a REST API sends a GET command to an HTTP website address and instead receives a response in the JSON format. And we'll go into JSON as I mentioned, but you can see it's highly similar. And although REST APIs can provide additional formats and protocols, KnowledgeSync is designed to communicate via HTTP and receive a JSON response. So there are other ways that those responses can come in. So let's get excited about REST APIs and what they mean. So first of all, companies use many cloud services. If we look at this study, which was done by Netscope, April of 2017, they were looking at the number of cloud services used by a single enterprise on the average. And you can see the numbers are absolutely surprising. The average company uses 91 marketing cloud apps, 90 HR apps, 70 collaboration, and so on down the line. And what's important to note is these cloud apps typically have REST APIs, and it's very helpful to try to do alerts and automation for these cloud apps that they're using. And this doesn't even count what they're using on-premise as well. When we look at top cloud services, there are many here that you recognize. I know I use my Google Gmail every day. I have a Google Drive account. You can see a lot of these that you would use every day. And then again, I want to reiterate, all of these have REST APIs that you can use for alerts and automation. And oh my God, what is all this? Look at the amount of apps available just for marketing. This is the marketing technology landscape, or what they call the MarTech 5000. These are web apps that companies use. As you remember from the one slide, the average company uses 91, or it was roughly 90 marketing apps. And you can see they're picking from all of these that you see here. And again, I wanted to show this because most of these, if not all of these, have REST APIs that you can use for alerts and automation.
If a customer's using the legacy script.
And then let's just look at the growth in web APIs since 2005. It's an unbelievable growth that you see here. As you can see, 22,000 web APIs available as of roughly January 2018, 2019. So an amazing number of REST APIs we can use for alerts and automation. We keep working on this term REST API, but there are other APIs available, and I just wanted to mention them because at least in KnowledgeSync and in version 10 that's coming out, we are only supporting REST. SOAP is the other major API that was popular for a number of years, but you can see the change in the growth of REST API compared to the others. And so here, even in 2011, 73% of web APIs were written in REST. And so that number has grown even more since then. So that is definitely the one that we need to be supporting and concentrating on. And I think the other thing you'll notice too is for most applications, I know, for example, I managed an instance of Sugar CRM at one point, and in the day when SOAP was popular, they had a SOAP API. And then when REST became popular, they also added REST. So in many cases, you'll see both or multiple of these available for a single web app. So let's just take a quick look at what a REST API does. Okay, so at a very high level, we see here how KnowledgeSync on the left would interact with a REST API on the right. And as we talked about, the REST API transmits over the internet. And so we might do a request such as get a list of users, and this could be just from any sort of web application, and we would issue a GET request to a URL. In this case, I just made it generic appdomain.com/users. And then what the application does on the other end is it will receive that request, it will authenticate it to make sure it's allowed to provide the answer that was requested. We'll go through some sort of business logic, and business logic can be anything like something very simple. Is the user that I just authenticated allowed to look at the data that that the user just requested? It could be something else like if a user says I would like to update a record, are they allowed to update it? And if they're updating it, are the values they specified for the update allowed values for the fields they were specified to update? So it could be a lot of different things in the business logic, but just think of it as rules that govern reading, writing, updating, and deleting data. But let's say in this case, everything checks out. We want to get the users from the database. Then the REST API takes that list of users, creates a response. And as we saw, this would be with a JSON body. And again, we'll look at what JSON is, and it transmits that back over the internet. And KnowledgeSync then receives the list of users. So I thought one of the best things we could do, and I will here come out of the presentation for a moment, and let me copy this URL, and I want to drop this in a chat window. So let me see what I did with my chat window. And I will drop this link. And if you would, just take a moment to click on the link that I dropped in the chat window. And we can use very simply our web browser to get an answer from a REST API. So let me just bring in a window, and I will paste that in here so you can see it. And what we got is a JSON formatted response in the web browser. So what we've just done essentially is make a call to a REST API. And if you've clicked on this link or copy pasted it into your browser from the chat window, you've also just made a call to the same REST API. This one happens to be a website in the UK that the government puts out there that lets you look up books essentially. And so here we've received information about this title, and you can see a lot of this, or most of it, is readable, just human readable like we've done, and it says the title is On Parade, Memoirs of Jewish Sergeant Major in World War II. And so we were able to get information. So now it is in this JSON format. Okay, so that is our sample REST API call. All right, so let's start here. This is the same one I copy pasted. And as we saw, what can you read from this response? And we can see a tremendous amount of information about this particular book that we just loaded. All right, well, let's move on. Now, why are REST APIs so popular? Well, we have many, many benefits as are listed here. So first of all, we looked at business logic and we talked about that briefly. And in the case of business logic, for a traditional, and traditional could be or would be most often a custom written integration. That's what I was thinking about when I was making the comparisons here. But in the case of business logic, where you're doing CRUD methods, for example, this is create, read, update, or delete. You in a traditional integration, you would see this may not exist at all. So for example, you may be connecting directly to a database, for example, in which case you may have very little control over what is allowed to be created, read, updated, or deleted. And it could also be defined, for example, in a third-party application, which is also commonly done, but not the best way to do an integration. If you compare that with a REST API, where we have a very high richness of business logic, the REST API integrates, or the business logic is integral to that REST API. And then in addition, that business logic is shared with the application user interface. The REST API is often a backend for a UI. So in that case, it is also providing the business logic for the user interface. And then, as I mentioned, it's important that it lives with the ERP code and is updated and tested along with that code. In terms of data integrity, it's typically low in the case of a traditional integration, simply because you're often connecting directly to a database. And then also, if you're allowing users to directly update a database, they could potentially corrupt it. In the case of the REST API, you have a very high data integrity because you're requiring the user to go through a business logic layer. So the business logic layer would say, for example, you as a user are not authorized to delete records, or you as a user are trying to delete an order record that still has order items in the system, and we do not want to delete an order that has dependent items on it, just as an example. Authentication and permissions. In the case of traditional integrations, they're typically limited by the database, and so you have a very low fidelity, very low resolution on what those limitations may be, whereas with a REST API, typically in between the authentication and the business logic, you have a very high level of definition on what users are allowed to do. In terms of reusability, traditional integrations are typically coded one-to-one, so you may write an integration, for example, from, let's just throw one out there like Salesforce to MailChimp, and therefore if you write it just for Salesforce connecting to MailChimp, you cannot reuse that in case you want to connect, let's say it's Microsoft Dynamics to MailChimp. That would require a new one-to-one integration. Whereas with a REST API, you have now essentially built a universal socket. And so you have middleware, something, let's say it's KnowledgeSync. So that's what we're looking at here, being able to connect as much as, or anyone like that software able to connect, and any modifications you need to make are able to do that in KnowledgeSync, and you don't have to worry about making changes in the REST API. And then in the case of flexibility, you have typically low flexibility because that traditional integration has been hard-coded. Whereas with a REST API, again, you're reconfiguring the middleware that connects to the universal socket. In this case, maybe just a reconfiguration of KnowledgeSync. So lots of reasons REST APIs are so popular, as you saw in the examples earlier. All right, so as far as URIs and endpoints, we break them down as you see here. So an example would be this long address like you see here. These are just like what you see very commonly in your web browser as you're browsing through a list of items. It's composed of things like the base address, which is a domain name that you recognize, an endpoint address, usually the items after the single slash, in this case like users 123, and then parameters, like this one might designate something like give me 20 items from page 5 of the list. And you'll see these go into different places in KnowledgeSync, and we'll see an example of that when we work on Lasso. Always recommend checking the API documentation to verify the formatting, but very commonly you'll see these formats as you see below. You'll notice they're all prefixed with a URL. It's often /API or something very similar. And then you'll see maybe some name in plural like animals, and that would indicate you get a list of animals. And you would see something like this with the parameters to get 20 items from page 5. And then retrieving, updating, and deleting and which of those you're doing will depend on the verb. We'll look at that in a moment. But in this case, let's say we do a post, and then here we see we passed in an item ID of 8844. So this would indicate that we're updating an animal with ID 8844. So just a quick look at that. REST HTTP request and response formats. Now this is, as I mentioned, it's just like talking requests and responses to any web page as you do with your web browser today. So if you ever look at a raw response from a web page, it's no different than when you see what you see here. And when we get into what we're doing with KnowledgeSync in terms of setting up a REST API configuration, we will in some cases put things in the URL parameter. In some cases we'll add a header, and this section here is the header, and in some cases we'll put items in the message body. And as you see here, this is a JSON formatted body, which is very common for REST APIs. There are 4 verbs that are commonly used. So we have a get, which is used to retrieve a request resource. There's the post, which is typically like an insert, which is used to create a resource. There's a put, and that is used to update or replace, and a delete, as in I want to delete something. So we'll see those are used as well, and those are verbs that we pick when we configure KnowledgeSync. The different types of authentication. So this is when the REST API wants to know who you are. There is a lot of APIs out there that don't care. So you can just make a request and you don't have to authenticate at all. There's HTTP basic authentication, where you provide a username and password on every call to the API, and it will authenticate just like you would when you log into Facebook. There's an API key. With the API key, you register to use the API, and then the API assigns this key to you. and then you pass it to the API every time you call it. And you'll see this is very similar to what we do for the lasso example that we'll do here in a moment, where we get a token, or it works very similar to the API key. And then there's also this open authorization protocol, typically called OAuth. And in that case, you register to use the API. Then when you call the API the first time, you pass in your credentials. The API issues the key to you, but that key expires, and it could be 20 minutes later, it could be an hour later, as are typical periods of time. But when it expires, you send it your username and password again, and it gives you a new token. So all of these authentication methods are supported by KnowledgeSync, and we'll, like I said, we'll see an example of that. So let's look at JSON. What is this JSON? JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And a very easy way to, I think, for most people to get what JSON does is it represents an object in a way that is human readable. And I always show it with an XML example because it seems just about everyone has done this using XML. But in this case, I'm showing JSON representation of a list of students. And we see here the name of the list is students. It uses these colon separators, uses a bracket here for the array separator. We'll look at a few more examples here as we go, but here we see a list of 4 students: John, Steve, Peter, and Chaitanya. And we have ages for each and a city in which they reside. And we can see that same information in XML. XML has been around longer than JSON has. JSON is slowly taking over for most programmers, taking over XML. But if you see that same list of students in XML, it would look as you see here. So again, just simply represents an object. In the case of JSON path, this JSON path is a way to specify how you find the data within a JSON object. In the actual standard for JSON, the path is always preceded with this $ period. It's if you're using JSON path anywhere but KnowledgeSync, you would want the $ period, but we omit it when we're doing JSON path in KnowledgeSync. And again, we'll see that as an example. I wanted to also list a couple of links here. These links are in the manual for KnowledgeSync version 10 as well. The more useful of these, I think, is JSON path. So if you're ever needing to troubleshoot a path, you can use this website. You can post your JSON response in there. In one box, you can post the path in another box and see what the result is. If you're ever having trouble getting that path to work, it's a great resource for you. But as an example, we have that list of students from the previous page. We have a path here. It says, go into the list of students, go to, this would be the 3rd student because the index always starts at 0, so it's 0, 1, 2. So go to the 3rd student and give me the city. So as I go here in students, I go to the 3rd student, Peter, I get the city, and that's Chennai. Okay. Singular objects. So now we see in JSON curly brackets start and end an object. So you see the curly brackets. Colons separate the name and value components. You see the colon here. Commas separate name and value pairs. There's actually not any to separate in this singular example. And then you see things are surrounded by quotes. And those quotes represent strings or text. And if there's a number, it's actually not required. So here in this case, 28, it may or may not matter that it's surrounded in quotes, but if we wanted it to absolutely be interpreted as a number, we would leave off the quotes. But usually in KnowledgeSync, we're not calculating anything based on the numbers. We're simply forwarding that information as an alert or some sort of automation, and therefore the string representation is usually okay. So in this case, some JSON path examples, person.name, that would be Chaitanya Sinj, the age, 28, and the website, beginner's book. If we have an array of objects, as we see here, the formatting is very similar. First, note that that array is surrounded by these brackets, and then each element in the array has the commas as a separator. So in this list of 3 people, Steve, Peter, and Sophie, if we ask for the student at position 0, that's the first student, and their age, we see that would be for Steve, age 29. If we ask for students in the second index, which would be the third person, would actually be Sophie. And then if we put an asterisk in here, that would tell us to return the entire list. So give us the age of the entire list, and you would get a list that has all 3 ages, 29, 32, and 27. And then the last one would be nested objects, which is very similar to the array, but they're not numbered. So instead of being numbered, each element in the list is named. So here we have Steve, Pete, and Warren, and you would actually refer to their position using the name. So in this case, if we said students.steve.age, we would get 29. So we see here Steve, 29, and students.sup, and my apologies, it says Warren here, but this was sup, but we would get sup.gender, gender was female, and students age, and we said give me the person at the first index or the 0 position. Well, it's not an array, it's a nested list, and therefore we would actually get an error in this case. So that is some examples again of this JSON and JSON path. Okay, so let's look then at a REST API trigger example with Lasso CRM. Well, before we would do anything with Lasso, let me mention to you steps we should take to get ready to use a REST API. The license, we have to review the license. How is it allowed to be used? We always want to be conscious of that. In most cases, you know, you're going to be presented that license when you sign up for an account to use that REST API. But we want to just make sure there aren't any restrictions on that. Usage restrictions. There could be, for example, private use, non-enterprise use, something like that. In some cases, I've seen they may tell you you can only call the REST API 100 times per day. So you'll want to see what that is. Usually, it will stop working after you call it 100 times, but you'd probably like to know about that ahead of time. You'll need to see if you need to create an account, what the authentication method is. A lot of APIs are paid, so you'll have to enter your payment details. If you do want to use a paid API, check on the network accessibility. Of course, you have to be able to connect to that API across the network, so you may need to be able to get out or in through a firewall of some sort, but take that into account. You'll need to know what the endpoints are to input that into KnowledgeSync, and then you'll need to know what the response format is. How are things formatted? Some APIs, for example, will also allow you to choose the response format between, it could be plain text, HTML, XML, or JSON. And again, with KnowledgeSync, we need that JSON response. Okay, so let me show real quick Lasso. So in the case of Lasso, I've already logged in, and I can see here, at least with this sample account, that I've added 2 registrants. And I'm in here, David Austin, as a sales rep. So I've registered 2 people, one gentleman, Andrew Clark, and another, Bob Johnson. And in this case, in the case of Lasso, I did not find, for example, the API address or the authentication method or those things in the help documentation. I actually contacted support and got that from them. So in some cases that may be necessary. But what I did then is input that information into KnowledgeSync. So let me bring over my KnowledgeSync window. And I have already set this up, but let me show you what the configuration looked like. So I have an application here called Web API, and it has a sample query, which I do not need. I do have an event. We'll come back to that. But importantly, here in the Web API section, I have set up Lasso CRM. So let me edit that. I just entered a description of Lasso CRM. In the definition, here's where I put the URI, the resource, slash registrants. And let me mention very importantly while we're looking at this, when we count applications, and as you know, KnowledgeSync we license by the application, at least in the case of when we pair this with an ECI app like Macola or JobBoss or M1, we offer the single application that comes standard with KnowledgeSync Core, and then you can purchase an additional subscription to unlimited applications. So it's either going to be one application or unlimited. But the way it will count applications is by looking at one, how many actual database connections you have, which is what we looked at in previous training sessions, but you will also need a connection for each unique URI. So it will be important here is that when you input the URI is that you put the base URI here, so that can be counted as your connection, and then each resource in the resource field, because the resources will not count as a connection. All right, so in the case of Lasso, they require their authorization, and let's look at authorization here, to be passed in as an HTTP header. And I'll click edit here. So we see there are different parameter types. Okay, and we're using HTTP header. And what I don't want to do in this session is go through each one of these and exactly what they mean. They are very cleanly detailed in the user manual. You got an idea of what these were through the introduction earlier, but I want to at least say in this case we have the HTTP header. The key of that header is authorization, and then we had to pass in our token in the following format. And again, every API is going to be slightly different in how you authorize, but in this case, this is exactly what Lasso required, and the information for that formatting was provided through Lasso support. So it is in here and it is created, and when I go to the response tab, then KnowledgeSync will send this request and get a response for us. Okay, and so we see the JSON response here on the left. And again, it's in that same format that we just reviewed. Now, what's interesting about KnowledgeSync is that KnowledgeSync looks at the JSON and says, what are the possible paths within this response that I could use? And it pre-populates that list for us. So they did this all by itself. It said, what are the possible ways that I could look for data? And we see many, many possibilities. I've already picked a few below. So the one thing I'll note though, in the arrays, it looks at numbers. And so it actually looks at the indexes. But what it also allows is for you to create the entire list if you wanted. So we have items, as you see here, I'm sorry, so 0, we have items at index 1, and then items at, well, items 0 and 1. But if I wanted a list of those, or actually we can preview it, okay, but if I wanted the entire list, you can manually replace this with an asterisk to get the entire list. And so now when I preview it, I get item 0 end items 1. And when we create a variable out of this in KnowledgeSync, it is now a list variable. It's very similar, or exactly similar, to pulling a list of records from a database. And when we return that table in KnowledgeSync, it is put into a list variable. So here in the case of the REST API, if we get a list result, it is just exactly the same type of variable and used in the same way downstream with our event. What I want to show are some of these that I already created. What I wanted to do was pull that list of registrants from the database. And so we have personal ID here, first name, last name, and company. And the other thing you'll note is if I want to pull a list like in a table, I'm actually pulling it per column or per dimension. So I had to create one for the ID, one for the first name, one for the last name, one for the company. So this would be equivalent to, at this point, a 4-column table that we pulled directly from a database. So I want to draw that analogy for those of you that are already working with KnowledgeSync. Okay, so that is the Web API definition. So let me come back here to events. And so now let's use that Web API as a trigger. So when we go to add a trigger, we can do a Web API, which I've already done, the Lasso CRM. So there's nothing else to specify here. But if I click, I can edit that same definition again, because no different than what we just looked at. It's just a shortcut. Let's look at the deliverables. I created an email and I said, subject Lasso, well, let's make it registrants. It's not actually users. And then I did the standard KnowledgeSync begin repeat and end repeat. And I brought in here, for example, first name, could take that out. And as Don was showing in our earlier training, you can just drag and drop that in here and create the email. And so now we will do a list of users in the email. I picked my account to send from, and that's about it. So I'll go ahead and update that. And let me come back in here, subscribers. I just picked myself as a subscriber so that I could get this email to myself. And so with that, let's go ahead and, run. So that will schedule our email to run. So we'll check in on that here in just a moment. As I mentioned, while that event is running, I'll just show you Postman very quickly. Now, in the case of troubleshooting, this would most likely be done with consultants rather than support, and I'll show you that why that is here in a moment. But sometimes you will want to test REST APIs outside of KnowledgeSync. So I at least want to introduce you to this free tool called Postman, very commonly used to test and troubleshoot REST APIs. You can download and install this on your desktop if you feel you need it. And I actually have it open, and we'll show you here. But what I did was put in that same endpoint that we used in KnowledgeSync, and then I went here to the header section, and you can see it's very similarly defined as it is to the KnowledgeSync REST API definition. But here I put in the same header with a key value pair, key being authorization, and then I put this value of bearer and this token in here. And then we can send that request to Lasso, and we get back the same response. So just another way to go about this. Okay, so just again, quick introduction of this. And in the meantime, let's see how we're doing on, so as you see here, I got the email, and here are our users. So KnowledgeSync has called the REST API, gotten a list of users, inserted that into an email, and let me know what they are. Okay. This is actually the last topic with regard to support. So what are we supporting when it comes to REST APIs? This is very similar to our support policy for queries. What we will do in the case of REST APIs, answer general questions about the REST API features and their documentation, and we'll report defects if they're found. But what support is not expected to do is troubleshoot the call response, authentication, or authorization for the third-party REST API to which the connection is made. We're not troubleshooting any customization of the JSON path or any custom variables created from query or REST API trigger results. So in essence, the parts of the REST API beyond our control are not expected to be supported. So things like that, that Postman app that I showed you, that should not be required for support. But if you are doing professional services for a customer and setting up a REST API call, so for example, they said, I want you to set up a REST API call to my Salesforce instance, for example, or I want you to take users from my Macola instance and send them to my MailChimp account of something of that nature, where you are trying to figure out how to get this thing working and you need some additional help. That's where Postman might come into play. So I believe that is it. So what I want to do now is see what sorts of questions have come up. I don't have anything in the chat box yet.
So Dave, I'm going to put you on Kathy Ackerman's API team. You did such a fine job. So.
Well, Fred, thank you. Well, we'll give it just a minute here, and if anybody wants to do unmute yourself, I believe they can do that. Is that right, Stephanie?
Absolutely. I did have to mute a couple people, so if you try to speak and it won't work, just message that in the chat and I'll unmute you. No offense. Just some background noise. It happens. I will point out too, while we're waiting, this session was recorded, so no, not everyone was able to attend, and I will send that link out later. I said in previous sessions as well, we will be posting all of these sessions together so that if you'd like to review them, you can. I know not everybody on this call is going to support a product that will be getting V10 initially, but it's coming in the upcoming months, so we wanted to make this available to everyone. So these will be available for you to review closer to the release if it's not happening for your product yet.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would just mention here at the end is if anyone in consulting is getting into REST APIs and that's new to you, I would say we will do our best to make any sort of development resources available to you if it gets over your head, or if we can help you get up to speed on this, because in talking to so many at ECI, it's just a new topic for so many people. And it's not something we've had to deal with many of our products yet. So let us know how we can help you. Again, we're just trying to get the ball rolling so that you know what it is and have enough knowledge to be dangerous with these REST APIs. Greg, you're asking if we can share the presentation with the outside. I would say with a limited audience, because we were discussing with or some of our policies in terms of support. So I would want to be cautious about that. Maybe we can edit the part out at the end where we talk about support policy.
Yeah, we can definitely edit it. We can make sure there's nothing else in there, but we can edit it.
Okay. Well, I didn't see any other questions come in, so I think we are done.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.